The first thing Luke Carver saw that morning was the dust. It didn't come from the cattle. His herd was still penned in, quiet and still. This dust moved like a wall, creeping in from the eastern hills, rising under hooves steady, measured, purposeful. Luke stepped out of his barn, squinting against the sun that had barely cracked the horizon. The chill hadn't burned off yet. He adjusted the brim of his weather-worn brown hat and wiped his hand on his vest, the same dark canvas one he'd worn every day since spring thaw. He wasn't in the habit of grabbing his rifle first thing in the morning. Until now. They came into view slowly, one rider, then 5, then 50, until the entire ridge facing his ranch swarmed with mounted silhouettes. Feathers fluttered, lances glinted, horses snorted. Silent, still. 200 riders, maybe more, lined the slope above his land, casting long shadows across the brittle September grass. And at the front of it all stood a small figure, barefoot, in a torn, pale blue dress. The little girl from last night. Ayasha. Luke's breath caught behind his sternum like a bullet. He didn't move, not to his rifle, not to the door. He simply stared as the girl lifted her chin, dark eyes scanning the horizon. Then she raised her hand. And just like that, the entire war party began to descend. But the night before, none of this had existed, only a child and a man with no business saving anyone. It had started with the coyotes. He'd heard them howling near the creek bed just past midnight, closer than usual, sharp and hungry. Luke had saddled his horse, Whiskey, and rode out with a lantern and a rifle, expecting to find a calf down or a rabbit torn up. Instead, he found her. She was crouched behind a cedar stump, trembling so hard the lantern light flickered against her ribs. He'd never seen a child so thin, skin taut over bone. Her hair was matted and crusted with dirt, lips cracked open, dress nearly gray from dust. One bare foot was swollen, bleeding from a fresh cut. The coyotes had gone quiet when he stepped between her and them. He hadn't needed the rifle. Just the sound of his boots and the weight of his frame was enough. 6'5", shoulders like a barn beam, hands calloused from years of honest work. The kind of man wild things respected or feared. The girl didn't run. She only looked up at him, not crying, not begging. Just waiting. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded once. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask why she was alone in the cold, in the dark. That would come later, if it needed to come at all. He carried her back to the ranch in his arms, wrapped her in an old quilt that still smelled of hay and saddle soap, and fed her warm cornbread and leftover stew by the fireplace. She ate like she'd forgotten how to chew slow. Then she curled up inside the barn, among the hay and horses, and slept without a sound. Luke stayed up the rest of the night. He fixed a broken latch, whittled a piece of wood into the shape of a bird, and placed it by her bed of straw. Not because she needed it, but because she deserved something kind. When dawn cracked the sky, he made coffee strong enough to melt a horseshoe and cracked open the barn doors. And now this. 200 warriors, armed, silent, unflinching. The girl stepped forward. She walked across the open yard barefoot, bits of straw still clinging to her hair. Her chin was lifted. Her dress hung off her like a flag that had weathered a storm. She turned to face the riders, then spoke in a language Luke didn't understand, but one that filled the air like the sound of thunder rolling across prairie. Whatever she said, it made them dismount. All at once, the warriors climbed down from their horses and stood not as soldiers, but as witnesses. The tallest among them, face lined with time, stepped forward. His white braids fell over shoulders, cloaked in wolf fur. He looked not at the ranch, not at the house, but at Luke. Ayasha turned to Luke then, her voice clear. "This is White Bull." "He is my grandfather," Luke nodded slowly, his voice gravel in his throat. "You got family then?" She nodded. "He say you fed his blood." White Bull took a step forward, eyes sharp as flint, and spoke a single sentence in broken English. "You saved Chief's heart." The silence that followed was thick, not with threat, but with meaning. Luke had no words for it. None were needed. But something had changed, not just the dirt under his boots, not just the morning light bending through the trees, something deeper, something older. Because that girl wasn't just hungry, and those men weren't just warriors, and Luke Carver, quiet, stubborn, alone for nearly a decade, was no longer just a rancher. He was now something else entirely, and every lawman in the county was about to find out. Luke Carver stood in the doorway of his barn, hands loose by his sides, watching as the riders filled his yard like a river spilling its banks. The girl Ayasha had vanished into their ranks, swallowed by color and leather and dust. But not one warrior reached for a weapon. Not one man raised a voice. Luke didn't speak either. He didn't move for his rifle hanging on the wall or glance at the axe handle leaning near the post. He simply gave a slow nod and walked back toward the corral gate. A moment later, he returned with a large tin basin filled with water and set it on the ground, followed by a stack of clean rags and a wooden ladle. Then he stepped aside. One by one, the warriors came forward. Some dipped their hands. Others passed the ladle to elders. None made eye contact, but they noticed. White Bull, still mounted at the edge of the group, sat silent. His white braids lifted gently in the breeze, and his gaze never left Luke's face. He made no gesture to command his people, but they moved around him with the unspoken rhythm of respect. Even the horses seemed to understand that no sudden movement would be made today. Luke walked to the smokehouse behind the barn and returned with venison wrapped in cloth. Then another trip for cornbread, a pot of beans left simmering on the hearth. He set it all on the long bench outside his bunkhouse. No table, no speech, just a quiet offering laid out in the open air. A woman among the Comanche, her cheeks painted with red clay, took the food and passed it down a line of children, all silent as ghosts. No one smiled, but they ate, and they watched him. Luke didn't ask who they were or why they had come. It was clear now that Ayasha hadn't been lost. She'd been missing, and someone had come looking. He spent the rest of the morning mending a broken fence, sweat dripping down the side of his face as the sun climbed. Every so often he'd glance back toward the group gathered under the cottonwoods, but mostly he just worked. He didn't speak a word. At noon, White Bull dismounted. The old chief moved like a man younger than his years, though his bones creaked beneath the weight of something time couldn't quite carry off. He approached Luke slowly, pausing a few feet away. "You speak little," the chief said in English rough as rawhide. Luke pulled his gloves off. "Not much to say." The old man nodded. "But you fed her." "No name, no reason. She was cold. She was hungry." That's all I needed to know. White Bull studied him a long moment. Then his eyes drifted toward the girl. Ayasha now sat with the same children she'd once run from, but her posture had changed, no longer curled in on herself, no longer hiding. "She carried blood of warriors," the chief said, "but she needed a quiet man to remind her how to breathe." Luke didn't respond. The chief reached into a leather pouch at his waist and pulled out a piece of carved antler strung on sinew. He held it out to Luke. "She gave you nothing," he said. "So I give you this. From me." Luke took it, fingers closing slowly around the worn edges of the token. "I didn't do it for thanks." "I know. That is why it matters." White Bull turned, but before he walked away, he said something else. "Tomorrow we ride north, but she stay here for now. If you allow." Luke nodded. "She can stay as long as she needs." That evening, as the sun bled down behind the hills, the warriors broke camp. No sound but the jingle of tack and the shuffling of hooves. By nightfall, only the girl remained, sitting cross-legged near the barn, cradling the carved bird Luke had whittled the night before. Back in town, the whispers had already begun. The pastor's wife told the dressmaker she'd seen smoke out on the Carver land and knew something was wrong. The dressmaker told her husband, who told the sheriff, who told the judge. Words like harboring, endangering, breaking county code. The women of the Temperance Society gathered that evening in the church basement, fanning themselves and speaking in half-whispers laced with fear. One said she'd heard Luke had taken in a savage. Another claimed he was conspiring with them to start an uprising. A third said she'd always known there was something strange about a man who lived that far out and never came to services. By morning, a letter had been drafted. By noon, it had reached the desk of Judge Merriman, gray-haired, stiff-lipped, and eager for headlines. That afternoon, as Luke was splitting firewood out behind the barn, he heard the distant clop of hooves and the creak of a buckboard wagon. Sheriff Garland stepped down from the rig with dust on his boots and a folded paper in his hand. "You've been summoned, Luke," the sheriff said, not unkindly. "District Judge wants a word. Formal complaint's been filed. You're to appear in Pine Hollow by week's end." Luke leaned on the axe, sweat glistening on his brow. "About what?" The sheriff looked toward the barn, where Ayesha sat with the sketchbook Luke had given her that morning, tracing lines in the dirt. "About harboring," he said, "and inciting." Luke didn't flinch. "That right?" Garland sighed. "Folks in town are scared, Luke. Said you're letting the Comanche stage something out here. Said you fed a ghost and woke a fire." Luke looked back toward the barn, where the girl had now stood, her eyes alert. He picked up the antler token White Bull had given him, ran his thumb over the carved lines. "She's just a child," he said softly, "and people are afraid of the wrong things." Garland hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see you Friday at the courthouse." He climbed back onto the wagon and left without another word. Luke watched the dust trail vanish down the road. Then he turned and walked into the barn without looking back. Behind him, Ayesha whispered something in her language. Later that night, as Luke patched the roof of the chicken coop, he noticed something odd. A hawk, feather-long, white, and unmistakably placed tucked beneath the saddle he hadn't touched since the war. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew it wasn't there before. The courthouse in Pine Hollow sat like a boil in the middle of town square, red-bricked and puffed up with its own sense of righteousness. The bell in the tower hadn't worked in years, but the people inside still rang their judgments loud and often. Luke Carver walked into that building with dust on his boots and no lawyer at his side. The room quieted the moment he stepped in, not from fear, from presumption. The men in their collars and frock coats looked at him like he'd tracked horse manure across a velvet rug. The women lace-gloved, church-scented, eyes sharp with gossip watched from the benches with breathless interest. They had waited years for a reason to tear down the man who didn't come to their socials, didn't bow to their Bible-thumping husbands, didn't belong. Judge Merriman, white-haired and puffed up like a turkey, sat on the bench with his spectacles low on his nose and his tone higher than it needed to be. "Mr. Carver, do you understand the nature of the complaint filed against you?" Luke looked at him. "Not really. A charge of harboring a minor native child without federal consent. A secondary charge of defying County Ordinance Code 18C, which, if you'd like me to read, clearly states that no private citizen shall house or provide overnight shelter to a member of an unregulated tribal entity without express documentation approved by the Territorial Office of Indian Affairs." The words fell hard, like rocks dropped into a well. Luke said nothing. "Is it true," Merriman continued, voice oily, "that you allowed said child female, approximate age 10, to sleep on your premises overnight?" Luke nodded once. "She was hungry." That's all, the judge blinked. That may be, Mr. Carver, but hunger does not nullify law. Luke met his eye. Sometimes it ought to. A murmur rolled through the room. Merriman straightened. Careful, Mr. Carver. This is not a forum for your moral objections. The prosecutor, a lean man with spectacles too tight for his narrow face, stood next. He cleared his throat with theatrical pause. We've gathered statements from multiple members of the Pine Hollow Temperance League. Several testified to seeing smoke from the Carver property late into the night. One even swears she heard chanting. War chants, more murmurs. Further, a deputy claims he spotted no fewer than 15 mounted riders on the Carver land. Armed, Luke said nothing. The truth was worse than what they knew, but he wasn't about to give them more. Are you denying the presence of Comanche warriors on your ranch? The prosecutor pressed. Luke's voice was low. I'm not denying they were thirsty. The prosecutor's face reddened. This is a serious matter. The child in question is of unknown tribal status. Her presence, unreported, undermines our ability to protect our county from potential incitement. Merriman leaned forward. So, Mr. Carver, do you admit to violating Code 18C? Luke drew in a breath and let it out slow. I admit she was cold. That she was shaking like a leaf. That she hadn't eaten in what looked like days. I didn't ask for a badge before I handed her food. That is not an admission of innocence. No, Luke said, just a fact. The courtroom buzzed again, some with discomfort, others with approval. Sheriff Garland, standing quietly by the wall, shifted but didn't speak. He knew Luke, knew him before the war, knew him after, but knowing a man and defending him were two different weights to carry in this town. Merriman slammed his gavel. You will remain under review pending further investigation. If it is determined you knowingly defied territorial law, you may face seizure of property and imprisonment. Do you understand the gravity of that, Mr. Carver? Luke gave a slow nod. I understand that feeding a child might cost me more than just cornbread. Outside, the sky had turned gray with wind. Rain threatened the horizon. Luke walked back to his horse tied up near the general store, aware that every step was being watched from windows and behind curtains. He didn't stop to talk, didn't respond to the schoolmarm who muttered, he brought this on himself. Didn't even look at the preacher who made the sign of the cross as Luke passed. When he reached his ranch at dusk, Ayasha was waiting on the fence, feet swinging, a pencil behind her ear. You're back, she said softly. He nodded and handed her the cloth-wrapped parcel from town, inside charcoal pencils and a blank sketchbook. Her smile was small but real. Later that night, as Luke sat by the fire sharpening a dull knife, a shape moved outside his window. He didn't reach for a gun, just opened the door and waited. White Bull stood in the shadows beyond the porch. He didn't speak but stepped forward and laid something on the railing. It was a necklace bones, smoothed by time, strung together with sinew and beads of turquoise and red clay. Luke looked at him. White Bull finally spoke. She is one of us, but she is yours now, too. Luke swallowed hard. I didn't ask for that. No, the old man said. That is why it matters. Then, without another word, he turned and vanished into the dark. Luke stood there long after the wind picked up. Fingers curled around the bone necklace, the weight of it unfamiliar yet certain. Inside the barn, Ayasha stirred in her sleep. But near the back wall, buried beneath the hay, something new caught Luke's eye, an old U.S. Army cartridge belt, one he hadn't seen in years, one he thought lost when he quit the war. It wasn't there yesterday, and he hadn't brought it out. Someone had found it, and left it. Not everything buried stays gone. The wind came up strong that day, hot and fast, like it had somewhere to be. Dust whipped across the fields, rattling the barn doors and coating the water troughs with a thin layer of silt. The cattle lowed uneasy. The dog barked once, then settled under the porch, ears pinned back. Luke was in the south pasture mending the same fence he'd fixed twice this month when he saw the figure riding slow up the long stretch of road that led to his gate. A woman, alone except for a small boy seated behind her, arms wrapped around her waist. She rode like someone who hadn't been born to the saddle but had gotten there anyway. Each jolt of the horse made her wince, though she kept her back straight. Her dress pale blue, faded and worn whipped around her calves in the wind. It wasn't fine, but it was clean. Same for her boots, same for the boy's patched shirt. Luke leaned against the fence post, watching as she dismounted and tied her horse with practiced, careful hands. The boy didn't speak, didn't even look around, just stayed clinging to the back of her skirt. She took a breath, smoothed her dress, then stepped through the gate like she wasn't sure she'd be allowed. He met her halfway to the porch. "I heard you had work," she said, voice soft but firm. "Cooking, cleaning, maybe something more if you're short on hands." Luke nodded once. "Depends who's asking." "My name's Clara Lark." Her chin didn't shake, but her eyes flicked to his face, then down to his boots, then up again. "I'm a widow. My husband died 3 winters ago in a mining collapse outside Dead Horse Gulch. We've been moving since. This is Henry." The boy didn't react to the sound of his name. "He don't talk," Clara added quickly. "Hasn't since last November, but he's not trouble." Luke glanced at the boy, then back at her. "He hurt?" "Not anymore." He didn't press. "You cook?" he asked. "Enough to keep men alive and bread from burning." Luke nodded. "There's an empty room by the kitchen. It's clean, mostly. I'll pay in coin and supplies." Clara swallowed. "That'll be fine." He turned and started toward the house, not waiting for her approval. Inside, Ayasha watched from behind the barn wall, eyes alert. She didn't step out, just observed, her fingers still curled around the charcoal pencil Luke had given her. She saw everything, especially the way Clara never let go of Henry's hand, even when they crossed the threshold. By sundown, Clara had made stew thick enough to slow a horse and biscuits that didn't break teeth. Luke ate at the end of the long table in silence. Henry perched beside him like a shadow. Ayasha stayed in the barn, refusing to come in, but Luke left a bowl out for her with a biscuit on the edge. By morning, it was gone. Clara moved quiet around the kitchen. She didn't ask questions, didn't mention the broken window in the bunkhouse or the cracked mirror in the hallway. She cleaned them both anyway. She didn't touch the bone necklace on the mantel, but her eyes lingered there too long not to notice. Later that night, after Henry had fallen asleep curled up in a blanket beside the stove, Luke walked in to find Clara drying her hands on a towel, standing alone by the fire. "That necklace," she said without turning. "Where'd you get it?" "Gift," Luke replied. "From her people." Clara's shoulders stiffened. "I've seen one like it before." Luke said nothing. She finally turned. "Years ago, in Kansas territory, a girl I knew had one. Same bones, same red clay beads. She disappeared after a raid. No one ever found her." Luke's voice was low. "This girl have a name?" Clara nodded. "Ayasha." Luke stepped closer, slow. "The girl in the barn, that's her." Clara's face went pale, then flushed with something too tangled to name: grief, shock, guilt, maybe all of it. "I didn't think she survived," she whispered. "She did." Clara walked over to the mantel and touched the edge of the necklace. "Then she's tougher than I ever gave her credit for." Luke watched her, something shifting behind his quiet eyes. Outside, the wind howled again, rattling the shutters, and far beyond the ranch, a lantern flickered to life in Pine Hollow Judge Merriman's house, where a sealed letter waited for the federal agent due to arrive by train come morning. A letter that named Luke Carver not just as a harborer of illegal tribal miners, but as a possible conspirator in an anti-government incitement ring. The law was moving again, and this time it wasn't just words. The first real snow came down like ash, slow and steady, quieting the prairie with a kind of peace that made the world feel older. The wind died for once. Even the cattle seemed to breathe easier. Luke was in the barn that morning, hammering a new hinge into the stable door. The last storm had torn it loose, and the latch had been splintered since October. He worked with sleeves rolled up, fingers stiff in the cold, breath fogging in front of him. The world was white except for the smoke curling out of the chimney, the dark wood of the barn, and Clara's pale blue dress moving back and forth from the kitchen like a rhythm. She didn't talk much. Neither did he. But something had settled between them that needed no speaking, an understanding born from quiet labor. He split logs. She boiled stew bones down to broth. He fixed fence wire. She mended sleeves and socks. The silence between them didn't feel empty. Henry had taken to drawing. He found a stub of charcoal and started sketching animals on the side of the bunkhouse. First rabbits, then deer, then horses. Always horses. Dozens of them, and always in motion. Ayasha sometimes stood beside him, but never joined in. She just watched with her arms folded and her weight balanced, like she was used to being ready to run. But her eyes softened when Henry smiled, and once, just once, she handed him a strand of horsehair to tie his drawings with. Inside, Clara watched them both through the frost-laced window pane. She pressed her hand to the glass like she needed to be sure it was real. That night, they ate by firelight. Luke carved a wooden spoon for Ayasha and handed it to her without a word. Clara baked bread, burned the first batch, and cussed under her breath when she thought no one was listening. Luke smiled. By the end of December, the ranch felt more like something lived in than just survived. The wind could howl, the snow could pile up, but inside that little house there was warmth, stew on the fire, and the sound of quiet footsteps that didn't mean fear. But peace in a place like Pine Hollow never lasted long. The rumors were getting worse. The ladies at the church were calling Luke's land a den of rebellion. The sheriff was being pushed to take a stand. Merriman was drafting another complaint. They called Clara that woman with the half-wild boy, and Ayasha the savage girl he's hiding. They spoke about Luke's war record with suspicion now, how a man could disappear from the world for years and come back with calloused silence and no need for company. Then came the man with the scar. He rode in mid-afternoon on a mule-colored horse with eyes like fire and a coat too fine for someone honest. He tied up without asking and walked across the yard like he owned it. Clara saw him first. The blood drained from her face before she said a word. She dropped the ladle she was holding and backed toward the wall. Luke stepped off the porch slowly. The man looked up, grinned like a blade. His teeth were too white. His voice carried like it had practiced cruelty. "Well, I'll be. Clara May Lark. I thought you were dead." Clara didn't answer. "You still got that sharp tongue?" The man asked. "Or did the boy finally scare it out of you too?" Luke's boots crunched across the snow. The man turned toward him, not bothered. "Don't think we've met. Name's Randall. I'm family." Used to be, anyway. Luke didn't speak. Just looked once at Clara, who had frozen like prey. "Come to take her back," Randall said. "We had a deal, me and her daddy. Before the boy. Before she ran off like a coward. She's not leaving," Luke said calmly. Randall smirked. "She don't belong here." You think taking in runaways makes you righteous? All you've done is build yourself a house of ghosts. Luke didn't flinch. Randall stepped forward. She's mine by law. Ain't a judge between here and Durango that'll argue it. Clara shook her head. He's lying. My father sold me. I was 15. He traded me for a plow horse and a bottle Luke moved before anyone could blink. He stepped in front of Clara, his hand firm on her shoulder, pulling her behind him. He said nothing, but the message was clear. Randall looked at him hard. That your answer? Luke didn't move, didn't blink. Randall's hand drifted toward his belt, but before it reached the holster, Ayasha appeared beside Henry, her small hand curling around the boy's. She didn't speak either, but her stare landed on Randall like a knife. The man hesitated, then spat in the snow, turned and walked back toward his horse without another word. But as he mounted, he grinned again. Suit yourself, cowboy. We'll see what the judge says about harboring thieves and savages. You think this is over? You don't even know what game you're in. He rode off. Luke stayed still until the sound of hoofbeats faded down the ridge. Behind him, Clara was shaking. She didn't cry, didn't collapse, but she wrapped her arms around herself like trying to hold something in. You okay? Luke asked softly. I will be. He looked at her, really looked for the first time, maybe. There was more to her than what showed. Some broken pieces hadn't crumbled, just hardened. He nodded, then let him come. Later that night, when the others were asleep, Clara walked past the fireplace where the bone necklace still hung. She stared at it again, only this time her fingers reached out and traced one of the carved beads. Her brow furrowed, lips parting like something had clicked deep in her memory. She didn't say anything, but when she looked at Luke across the room, her voice shook with quiet recognition. I've seen that pattern before, but not in Kansas, in New Mexico, a long time ago, before everything Luke set down the pipe he hadn't lit. Where in New Mexico? He asked. Clara hesitated. A mining camp. A shipment went missing. So did a girl. They said she vanished without a trace. Luke's eyes narrowed. The fire cracked. And in the cold outside, snow began to fall again, soft, steady, and hiding the trail of someone already on their way back. Not to warn, but to take. The storm passed by mourning, but the silence it left behind clung to the rafters. The snow had piled high along the fence posts, soft as wool. Smoke drifted steady from the chimney, and inside the house the walls held more than heat. They held a question hanging between Clara and Luke like an unspoken name. She sat at the kitchen table, hands curled tight around a tin cup. Her eyes looked far beyond the room. Henry was asleep on the cot by the stove, arms wrapped around a stuffed burlap horse Luke had stitched together the week before. Ayasha was outside, building something with sticks and snow, alone as always. Clara hadn't spoken much since Randall left, but today her voice cracked the air without warning. My name isn't really Clara. Luke turned from the counter, knife still in hand, halfway through peeling a potato. She looked up at him. It's the name I gave myself, but it's not the name I was born with. He didn't speak, just waited. She took a breath that shivered its way out. I was 12 when my mother died. My stepfather moved us west, said there'd be work in the mining camps near the border. What he didn't say was that he wasn't going there for work. He was going to trade Luke set the knife down. He ran a camp, Clara continued. Not mining. Not really, he called it labor leasing. But what it was a holding pen for children. Native mostly, some Mexican, some even white, ones who didn't have papers or family. The ones nobody would miss. Luke's jaw flexed. I was the cook's helper, cleaned, scrubbed, handed out bread. Sometimes I had to brush the girl's hair, make them look clean before buyers came. They weren't buyers, of course, just men with gold and guns. And every week 1 or 2 of the girls would disappear. She closed her eyes. I never knew their names. Most didn't speak English. But one girl, she had this fire, like she wasn't afraid of the dark. She used to hum songs in her language, even when the rest of them were silent. She'd sneak me pieces of jerky she stole from the supply cart. She didn't talk much, but when she did, she called me Shima. I didn't know what it meant, just thought it was a name. She looked toward the window. Then one night there was a fight. One of the buyers came drunk, tried to take her early. She bit him, drew blood. My stepfather beat her for it, said she was ruined, said he'd sell her off cheap or kill her outright. Luke's hands clenched around the back of a chair. I couldn't let that happen, Clara said. I waited till the moon was high, then cut the gate and slipped out with her. We ran through the dry gulch, barefoot. She bled the whole way. We reached the river, and I told her to follow it north, that someone would help her. But I went the other way. I thought it would give her a better chance. She paused. I never saw her again. Never knew if she made it. Thought maybe they caught her. Luke walked slowly to the fireplace, took the bone necklace from the mantel and placed it gently on the table in front of Clara. She stared at it, eyes widening. That's hers, she whispered. She wore it around her wrist back then. The beads. I remember the pattern. Luke's voice came quiet. Her name is Ayasha, and she's out there now playing in the snow. Clara's hand went to her mouth. I didn't know, she choked. All these years, I didn't know she lived. You helped her live, Luke said. You just didn't see it. Outside, the barn door creaked open. Ayasha stepped in from the cold snow, clinging to the hem of her dress. She saw Clara sitting at the table, her back rigid, her hands trembling near the necklace. Ayasha didn't speak at first, just stood in the doorway, wind pushing her hair across her face. Then, softly, in the language only she and her people knew, she said one word. Shima. Clara turned, breath caught in her throat. Ayasha took a step forward, then another. Her expression didn't change, but her voice, when it came again, held something ancient, something gentle. Older sister. Clara knelt, arms open, and Ayasha walked straight into them. Neither wept, but the way they held each other said everything tears could not. Luke stood in the corner, hat in hand, watching with something raw behind his eyes. Then came the knock. 3 short raps on the door. Hard, certain. Luke stepped forward, hand resting instinctively near his side. He opened the door slowly. White Bull stood there, snow crusted on his shoulders, eyes sharp as stone. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood 2 more elders, cloaked in fur, faces marked with soot and paint. White Bull didn't smile, didn't nod. He just looked past Luke into the room at Clara, still holding Ayasha, at the necklace on the table, at the fire burning low. Then he spoke. She is not yours, he said, voice deep as the canyon, but her blood remembers, and her blood has called us back. Luke stepped aside, letting them in, heart pounding slow and heavy in his chest, because this time White Bull hadn't come to thank him. He'd come for something else entirely. The man who stepped off the eastbound train at Pine Hollow Station didn't wear a uniform, but everyone in town stood straighter when they saw him. He wore a long black coat, heavy leather gloves, and a hat stiff enough to slice a shadow across his sharp jawline. His boots weren't dusty, his eyes didn't blink, and when he walked through the sheriff's door with a leather satchel and a folded federal letter in hand, Garland didn't even ask his name. He just nodded and said, "He's at the ranch." By the time the federal agent reached Carver Land, it was past noon and the snow was melting into gray slush. Luke stood at the fence line, fixing a broken post with Ayasha's help. She handed him nails, never saying much, but watching everything. The man dismounted without asking. His horse was sleek, with polished tack and government saddle. "You Luke Carver," the man said. Luke nodded once. "I'm Agent Cyrus Dunley, Bureau of Tribal Affairs and Child Relocation. I'm here under Order 41B to collect the Comanche miner under your supervision." Luke didn't move. "She's not under my supervision. She's under my roof." Dunley opened the satchel and pulled out a folded paper. "The federal government has deemed all native minors without verified guardians to be subjects of custody under the Child Welfare Relocation Act. That means she is, by law, a ward of the state and must be placed in a certified management facility." Luke took the paper, but didn't read it. "Facility like a school?" "No, a holding center until she can be reassigned. She's got family. Her grandfather's in my house." Dunley's tone stayed flat. "Not recognized under our jurisdiction. Tribal bloodlines don't carry legal weight unless documented through federal census rolls." Ayasha stepped closer to Luke, just enough to brush her shoulder against his coat. "She's not going with you," Luke said. Dunley blinked. "That's not your decision to make." "It is if you're standing on my land saying it." The agent smiled, cold and controlled. "Let me explain something, Mr. Carver. You are harboring a fugitive minor. That's one count. You've refused prior summons. That's two. And according to Judge Merriman's submission, you've been operating a property that may be involved in sedition against territorial authority. That's three." Luke didn't flinch. "If the child isn't surrendered by tomorrow morning, you'll be placed under arrest. Your land seized under forfeiture clause. And any persons aiding you, namely, the woman staying here and her son, will be processed as accessories." Behind them, Clara stepped onto the porch, Henry's hand in hers. Dunley looked at her and smiled again. "I suggest you think hard about what you're protecting. And what it'll cost." White Bull emerged from the barn. He didn't speak at first, just stood between Luke and Clara. Then his voice, when it came, filled the yard like thunder. "If you take her," he said, "we end every word spoken between our nations and yours. Every promise, every treaty, every lie dressed as law." Dunley's face tightened. "I don't take orders from ghosts." White Bull stared through him. "Then you will answer to the living." Ayasha took a step forward, eyes locked on the agent. She didn't cry, didn't plead. But when she reached up and placed her hand on Luke's, the meaning was clear. Dunley mounted his horse. "You have until sunrise," he said. "After that, no one protects you." He turned and rode out, snow kicking up behind him like the dust of war. That night, Clara stood at the window while Luke carved wood in silence. "You could leave," she said quietly. "You could take Aisha, go north, vanish into the hills. I know places." Luke didn't look up. "Runnings for men with something to hide." "You're not hiding?" "No," he said. "I'm right here." She stepped closer. "They'll come with papers." "With guns. Then they'll know where to find me." He glanced at the fire, then at her. "You still got that dress?" She blinked. "What?" "The pale blue one. From the day you came." She nodded. "You might want to wear it tomorrow." She stared at him, and something passed between them. Not romantic, not tender, something deeper. Something about choosing to stand when the wind rises. Outside, the wind did rise, and in the darkness beyond the hill, a second rider watched the house from the shadows. But he didn't work for the government. He worked for Randall. The sky was the color of pewter the morning Luke Carver walked into town with Ayasha at his side. The streets were lined with silence. No one called out. No one smiled. But neither did they spit or curse like before. Folks just watched from windows, from porches, from behind their shop doors, as the giant cowboy in his worn brown hat and dust-colored vest led the native girl through the snow-dampened streets and into the courthouse. Behind them, Clara held Henry close, her hands trembling only when she wasn't holding his. White Bull followed on horseback, draped in silence, his stare fixed on the front door of the building that had once promised justice and rarely delivered it. The courtroom was full. Judge Merriman sat high on the bench, his robe pressed, jaw tight. Agent Dunley stood just to the left, arms crossed, papers folded tight under one hand. His eyes never left Ayesha. The weight of federal law hung in the air like a noose waiting to drop. Luke didn't speak at first, just stood tall beside Clara, Ayesha between them. Her hand gripped his coat, but her chin was up. Merriman cleared his throat. "Mr. Carver, you are hereby required to release custody of the minor to the custody of the Bureau of Tribal Affairs. Do you comply?" Luke shook his head. "No." The courtroom murmured. Merriman leaned forward. "Then we will proceed with charges of obstruction, harboring a fugitive minor, and contempt of federal authority." Just then the side doors opened. 3 men stepped inside, ranchers by the look of them. Dust still clung to their coats. One of them, a wiry man with a sun-scorched face and a limp in his left leg, raised his voice. "Judge Merriman, I got something to say, "You'll be removed if you speak out of turn," the judge barked. But the man stepped forward anyway. "My name's Earl Dandridge. I run cattle up on Mule Creek. 2 winters ago, I lost near every steer I had. Would have gone belly up if Luke Carver hadn't brought feed to my door and fixed my fence without asking for a damn thing in return." More murmurs. Another rancher stepped up beside him. "He helped me dig a new well when my daughter took ill. No charge. Didn't say a word, just brought his tools and worked till it was done." A third man spoke. "He gave my wife flour when we had nothing but dust. Said it was extra. We knew it wasn't." The crowd stirred. Even the court stenographer paused her typing. Dunley scowled. "That's all very charitable, gentlemen, but the law doesn't measure kindness." Then a woman's voice came from the back. "I can tell you what it should measure." Heads turned. She stepped forward in a faded nurse's coat, gray hair tied back, her posture tired but proud. "My name's Edith Moore. I used to work as a nurse at the regional relocation facility east of Santa Fe. 20 years," Merriman blinked. "You're not on the docket, ma'am." "No," she said, "but I got something you all need to hear." She walked to the front and unrolled a bundle of papers. Inside, copies of intake forms, a hand-drawn sketch, and a photograph aged, cracked, and unmistakable. "This is her," she said, pointing at Ayesha. "She came in when she was about 5. Name listed as unknown, but she had this." Edith held up a drawing, a sketch made by another girl who came in just before. They arrived together. Same night, different paths. She turned to the judge. "The one who drew this disappeared after the first week, never documented, never transferred, vanished. I filed a complaint. Got reassigned 2 months later." Merriman stared, uncertain. "This girl," Edith said, gesturing to Ayesha, "was on no list. Had no number. That means she was never in federal custody to begin with. That means you got no legal claim." Dunley stepped forward. "You're bluffing." "I got records," she said calmly, "and I got names of others who remember." The judge sat back, pale. Luke turned to Ayesha. "You good?" She nodded once, eyes still locked on Edith. Merriman cleared his throat again, but this time it came weaker. I will review the documents." A formal pause is in order, but outside the crowd was already growing. Word had spread. Families Luke had helped. Mothers Clara had nursed when sickness ran through the town. Old soldiers who remembered Luke from the war. Small ranchers tired of being quiet. They filled the courthouse steps by sunset. Luke didn't say a word. He just walked home the way he always had. Quiet, steady, Ayasha at his side. Behind them, the crowd didn't cheer. They just nodded. They just followed. Later that night, Clara sat by the fire, a bundle of fabric across her lap. Henry slept by the stove, one hand still gripping a wooden horse. Luke came in from the cold, stamping snow from his boots. She looked up at him, smile soft. "I started something," she said, holding up the old dress, pale blue, worn thin, torn in places but still whole. "I figured if we make it through tomorrow, maybe I'd wear it again. Maybe for the right reasons this time." Luke didn't answer. He just watched her thread the needle, hands steady, eyes fixed on something only she could see. Then, from outside, came the sound of hooves. Not many, just one, fast, urgent, and headed straight for the ranch. The sky broke clean and wide the morning Luke Carver married Clara Lark. Not a cloud dared drift across that hard blue canvas above the open prairie. The wind held still like it, too, had been invited to witness. Snow had melted into earth. The ground was soft but dry, the grass just beginning to remember spring. And out where the field sloped behind the barn, beneath the cottonwoods, a patch of land had been cleared and swept by hand. There were no pews, no altar, no preacher in black robes. Just a line of wildflowers tucked into the dirt, chairs borrowed from every home in town, and a pine wood table where Henry had drawn horses along the side with charcoal, his silent way of blessing it. Luke stood near the center of it all, a clean shirt pulled tight across his broad shoulders, his brown vest pressed and stitched where it used to tear at the seams. His boots were scuffed, his jaw freshly shaved, and his face unreadable as always. He held his hat in one hand, his fingers drumming slow against the brim. Then Clara stepped through the doorway of the house, and the wind finally remembered to breathe. Her dress, soft, faded blue, fluttered at her knees. It wasn't new, it wasn't tailored, but it had been washed and mended and pressed with care. There were still seams that spoke of years past, tears that couldn't quite be hidden. But she walked with her chin high, her steps steady, Henry beside her holding tight to her hand. The town gathered, not all of them, but enough. The blacksmith and his wife, the dry goods merchant, the old couple from across the river who'd once lost a calf in a flood and found it safe on Luke's land 3 days later. Men who'd once whispered about harboring, women who'd once clutched their purses a little tighter when Clara passed. Now they watched in silence, not with judgment, but with something closer to reverence. White Bull stood beneath one of the cottonwoods, arms folded, his shadow long. Beside him, Ayasha held something wrapped in cloth. The ceremony was brief. Sheriff Garland, clean-shaven and sober for once, read the vows aloud with his hat in hand. His voice cracked halfway through, but he didn't stop. When he asked if anyone objected, no one dared even shift in their seat. Luke took Clara's hands in his, calloused and scarred, but gentle as river-worn stone. "I never thought I'd stand in front of people again," he said quietly. "But you never asked me to be more than I am. Just to be honest." Clara's voice was a whisper. "You've already been more than I ever hoped." They kissed, slow, true. No cheering followed, just the wind moving through the trees like a hymn older than English. Afterward, as folks stepped forward with bread and baskets, with jars of pickles and hand-carved spoons, Ayasha walked to the edge of the crowd, where a little girl from town sat hugging a worn doll. Ayasha knelt, unwrapped the cloth she carried, and placed the bone necklace into the child's small hand. The girl looked up, wide-eyed. "She's scared," Ayasha said to no one in particular. "She'll need this now more than I do." Clara watched the exchange from afar, her hands folded at her waist, eyes misted. Luke stood beside her, looking not at the crowd but at her face. "You saved me too, Clara," he said. She blinked, startled. "I didn't think I was worth saving." "You didn't need to be," she said softly. "You just had to stay." They stood there a while, long after the food had been eaten, long after the sun began to dip westward. Children chased one another in the grass. Henry curled up in a pile of quilts beside the porch, fast asleep, his breathing even. Clara's fingers found Luke's. "I didn't believe in happy endings," she said. "Me neither. But this don't feel like an ending." "It isn't." Then came the sound of distant hooves, slow, steady, singular. Someone was riding in from the ridge. White Bull's eyes narrowed. Luke didn't reach for a weapon, but he did take a step in front of Clara, just in case. The cottonwood bloomed late that spring, long after the last frost broke, and the fields turned soft underfoot. The buds unfurled like the land had finally exhaled. Birds nested along the beams of the barn. A fresh fence stretched clear across the east field, staked and hammered by neighbors who once wouldn't wave across a dirt road. Carver Lock Ranch, as folks had come to call it, looked different now. Not because of the paint Clara had added to the shutters or the new porch Henry helped sand with his tiny hands. It looked different because it was full of voices. Children's voices. Some spoke only Comanche, others only English. A few, like Ayasha, had learned both, mixing words with ease, moving between languages like threads in a quilt. They came from distant counties and nearby ravines, from wagons left at borders and letters sent with no names. Orphaned, cast off, forgotten, until someone pointed toward the land west of Pine Hollow and said, "Go there. That place will take you in Luke-built bunk beds out of cedar." Clara boiled soup by the barrel. White Bull oversaw the planting of corn in a small square behind the barn, insisting it grow not for sale but for ceremony. Edith Moore came by once a week with bandages and bottles, and stayed longer each time, eventually moving into the old bunkhouse without ever saying she had. The boy Henry had grown taller. His silence had stretched too, deeper and longer, but something in his face had softened. He smiled more now, drew less. One morning, Clara caught him standing beside the porch with Ayasha, watching the chickens. He tugged gently at her sleeve. "Say it again," he whispered. She smiled. "Mama." He turned to Clara, lips trembling, and said it once. "Mama." She dropped the laundry basket right there in the grass. Later that day, she told Luke about it, barely able to get the words out. Luke didn't say much, just put his arms around her and held her so long the bread burned in the oven. That evening, the townspeople came, carrying baskets and blankets, wooden toys and used books, flower seeds and nails. They didn't come out of obligation anymore. They came because they wanted to. Because they'd seen what happened when you fed a child and what that child could become. By sundown, someone had pulled out a camera, the old kind, with the black curtain and the powder flash. They gathered under the cottonwood tree, the same one where Clara and Luke had been married. Luke stood in the center, Clara at his side. Ayasha leaned into Clara's hip, arms crossed, but smiling in her way. Henry held a small wooden horse in one hand, his other resting gently on Ayasha's wrist. Around them stood the others, the ranchers, the townsfolk, the children, White Bull, Edith, even Garland, who still refused pie, but brought extra nails every time. The flash popped, the shutter clicked, and the moment was captured. Later, Clara wrote on the back in her careful script, "We fed one child, and the world changed." As the sun dipped and the shadows stretched long across the grass, Luke stood alone for a moment by the pasture fence. He watched the children run in the dusk light, watched Clara gather them like stars. He felt something he hadn't known in years: peace. But he also knew peace didn't last forever on this kind of land. Trouble still stirred in the counties east. Trains were coming through with federal men aboard, and folks whispered about new land deeds, new taxes, new fights. He'd face it when it came. He always did. But for now, he let the wind wash over him, soft as a prayer. And somewhere in the barn, Ayasha was carving a new bird from wood smaller, lighter, made to fit in the hand of the next child who'd need it. Because more would come, and the ranch would be ready. If this story reached your heart, and you believe in the kind of frontier where kindness still wins, where silence can shelter a soul, and where one quiet cowboy can change the fate of a forgotten child, then don't ride off just yet. Subscribe to Western Legacy, and stay with us for the next chapter. We've got more stories to tell, and more justice to ride for.